For most of the 20th century, one beer outsold almost everything else in America. Not Budweiser, not Miller, Schlitz, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. That was its actual slogan. And nobody laughed, because it was simply true. When American soldiers came home in 1945, Schlitz was waiting on tap. When your grandfather ordered a beer in 1950, odds were better than 1 in 20 that it was a Schlitz. This was not a beer brand. It was furniture in American life, 100 years old, run by one family, brewed one way, and then, in the span of about 10 years, it vanished. Not because of prohibition, not because of a war or a depression or a scandal in the boardroom. Schlitz died because of a series of small, sensible-looking decisions, each one defensible on a spreadsheet, each one invisible to the men who made it, that added up to a corpse. Business schools have a name for it now. They call it the Schlitz Mistake. This is the rise and fall of Schlitz, the beer that killed itself. The strange thing about the Schlitz story is that Joseph Schlitz barely appears in it. In 1849, a German immigrant named August Krug started brewing beer behind his Milwaukee restaurant. Milwaukee in 1849 was arguably the best place on the planet to start a brewery. German immigrants with brewing knowledge arriving by the boatload, Lake Michigan ice for cold storage, and a thirsty young Chicago 90 miles south. A year later, Krug hired a bookkeeper, a careful, methodical man named Joseph Schlitz. And when Krug died suddenly in 1856, it was the bookkeeper who took over the business. 2 years later, he married Krug's widow, Anna, and put his own name over the door. Say what you will. The man understood ownership. Then came the night that made the brand. In October 1871, the Great Chicago Fire burned 4 square miles of the city to the ground, and with it, Chicago's own breweries and its water supply. Milwaukee's brewers loaded barges and sent beer south into the ruins, and Schlitz poured more enthusiastically than anyone. As the story goes, a city that had lost everything discovered what Milwaukee already knew. The slogan that would carry the company for a century, the beer that made Milwaukee famous, grew out of that moment. Brand lore? Partly. But it's the kind of lore you can't buy. Joseph Schlitz didn't live to see what his name would become. In 1875, sailing to Germany to visit his birthplace, his ship, the SS Schiller, went down off the Scilly Isles, and Schlitz drowned. He had run the brewery for just 19 years. The company would wear his name for another 151. Control passed to the Uihlein brothers, nephews of the original founder Krug. And under the Uihleins, Schlitz stopped being a brewery and became an empire. By 1902, it was the largest brewer in the United States, pushing past 1 million barrels a year. In 1912, it pioneered the brown glass bottle, because Schlitz had figured out that sunlight skunks beer, a detail that matters later. So, hold on to it. This was a company whose entire identity was caring about what's inside the bottle. The Uihleins became one of the richest families in America. And the beer stayed good. Schlitz survived the one thing that should have killed it. Prohibition shut down every brewery in America for 13 years. When it ended in 1933, Schlitz came back so hard that within a year, it was again the best-selling brewery, not in America, in the world. And the post-war decades were the golden age. By the late 1940s, Schlitz was the #1 beer in the United States, locked in a heavyweight title fight with Anheuser-Busch that would define both companies. The two traded the crown through the 50s like champions trading belts. The first crack came from an unexpected direction. In 1953, Milwaukee's brewery workers walked out for 76 days. Schlitz's home city, its entire production heartland, stood still while Anheuser-Busch, with breweries elsewhere, kept shipping. AB took the #1 spot that year. Schlitz clawed back, but after 1957, it would never hold the crown again. Remember that, too. The lesson Schlitz took from 1953 wasn't protect the beer. It was never let production stop. Still, second place in post-war America was a license to print money because the market itself was exploding. Suburbs, supermarkets, refrigerators in every kitchen, and a television in every living room. And Schlitz understood television advertising as well as anyone alive. This is the era of the great Schlitz copywriting. Real gusto in a great light beer. When you're out of Schlitz, you're out of beer. A slogan so confident it barely qualifies as advertising. It's a worldview. And the numbers backed the swagger. Between 1950 and 1977, while dozens of regional breweries died, Schlitz's share of the entire American beer market doubled from 7% to 14%. Follow that. 1 in every 7 beers drunk in the United States, from a company still run by the founding family, still headquartered in the same city, still telling itself the same story it had told since the Chicago fire. The beer is the brand. The brand is the beer. In 1967, that family handed the company to Robert Uihlein Jr., grandson of August, Harvard-educated, a champion polo player, by every account a charming and confident man. He inherited the second biggest brewery on earth, a century of goodwill, and a beer people genuinely loved. It took him about a decade to spend all three. Here's the thing about the decisions that killed Schlitz. Every single one of them made sense. Beer is expensive to make mostly because beer is slow to make. Barley malt costs money. Fresh hops cost money. And fermentation time is money sitting in a tank doing nothing. Weeks of it, at industrial scale. Robert Uihlein's team looked at all of that and asked the most natural question in corporate America. What if we just did it faster and cheaper? So they did. The program was called Accelerated Batch Fermentation. Traditional Budweiser spent 32 to 40 days becoming beer. Schlitz cut its process to 25 days, then 21, then 15. By the early 70s, Schlitz was fermenting beer in less than half the time of its biggest rival, and boasting in 1973 that it ran the most efficient breweries in the world. They swapped a portion of the malted barley for corn syrup, because corn syrup is cheap. They swapped fresh hops for hop pellets, because pellets are cheap. And each change came with the same internal reassurance. Consumers can't tell the difference. In blind sips, honestly, most couldn't. The stock market certainly couldn't. Margins went up. The share price went up. Every quarter, the spreadsheet said, it's working. But the spreadsheet had no column for what beer is. Beer brewed that fast is chemically unstable. Proteins stay suspended, and when the beer gets cold, it turns cloudy. Schlitz's fix was not to slow down. It was to add silica gel, an anti-haze agent, to strip the proteins out. A patch on a patch. The beer in the bottle was now, molecule by molecule, a different product wearing a 120-year-old label. Understand the pressure Uihlein was under, because he wasn't stupid, and he wasn't lazy. Philip Morris, a tobacco company with tobacco money, had bought Miller and was carpet-bombing television. Miller Lite was inventing an entire category that Schlitz's own light beer would later fail to crack. Anheuser-Busch, meanwhile, went the other direction. It kept its slow fermentation and spent millions telling America exactly how long good beer takes. two strategies, diverging. One competitor made time a cost. The other made time the product. And here's the mechanism that makes this a tragedy instead of a blunder. Cost-cutting is a one-way ratchet. The first cut works, margins jump, nobody notices, and the executive who made it gets promoted on the numbers. So the next cut is easier to approve, and the one after that is expected. Reversing a cut, though? That's walking into the board and volunteering to make next quarter worse to defend something no metric can see. Nobody marches in the street because fermentation dropped 10 days. There is no press conference for hop pellets. The damage compounds silently, like interest. That's what makes the Schlitz mistake so instructive and so frightening. Quality doesn't collapse. It leaks. Salami slice by salami slice, as one business writer put it. Each slice too thin to taste. Right up until 1976, when all of it came due at once. In 1976, Schlitz's management got word that the FDA might soon require brewers to list ingredients on the label. For most breweries, fine, water, barley, hops, yeast. For Schlitz, a problem. Nobody wanted to print silica gel on the beer that made Milwaukee famous. So they made the fatal substitution. A new anti-haze agent called Chill Guard, chosen specifically because it would be filtered out before bottling, which made it, legally, non-disclosable, invisible on the label. What the lab work missed was that Chill Guard reacted with the foam stabilizer Schlitz also added. In the sealed bottles, on warehouse shelves, in delivery trucks across America, the two additives found each other, and proteins began to clump and settle. At best, it looked like tiny white flakes drifting in your beer. At worst, and this is the description that stuck from the people who saw it, it looked like snot. And here is where Schlitz stopped being a victim of chemistry and chose its own ending. Management knew, and for months, management said nothing. Robert Uihlein's position was that the haze wasn't actually physically harmful, which was true and could not have mattered less. People don't drink beer because it's harmless. When the company finally acted, it acted in the dark. A secret recall. 10 million bottles and cans quietly pulled back, at a cost of $1.4 million. Call it $6.5 million today. One of the biggest product recalls in American brewing history, conducted like a burglary. The secret held about as well as the beer did. You cannot quietly unsell 10 million bottles. Distributors noticed trucks coming back full. Bartenders noticed cases being swapped. And drinkers who'd been poured a glass of Flakes didn't need a press release. They just needed a different beer. And 1970s America offered plenty. Sales turned down, then kept turning. That same year, Schlitz finally answered Miller Lite with a light beer of its own. Schlitz Light landed with a thud. Because the one thing a diet version of your beer cannot survive is people already doubting the regular version. And in the middle of it all, Robert Uihlein Jr. was diagnosed with leukemia and died within months. The last Uihlein to truly run the company. Gone before the consequences of his doctrine fully landed. A century of family control ended in a hospital room with the Flakes still on the shelves. What followed was a revolving door. Eugene Peters, chief executive for all of 11 months before resigning. Then Frank Selinger, a celebrated brewmaster poached from Anheuser-Busch itself, hired to reteach Schlitz how to make Schlitz. The right man, 5 years too late. You can rehire the craft. You can't rehire the trust. Which brings us to the marketing department's rescue attempt, one of the most infamous campaigns in advertising history. In 1977, Leo Burnett built ads around defending your gusto, a menacing boxer, a lumberjack with a black eye and an actual cougar, growling at the camera. "You want to take away my gusto?" America looked at the beer with Flakes in it, now apparently threatening violence, and gave the campaign its immortal nickname, "Drink Schlitz, or I'll kill you." It ran 10 weeks. Then Schlitz killed the campaign instead. Think about the sequence. The beer got worse, quietly. It got recalled, secretly. And the first loud public thing the company did was threaten the customer. Trust doesn't survive that order of operations. By 1980, the numbers were terminal, passed by Miller, then passed, painfully, in its own backyard, by Pabst. Breweries running half-empty. So the new leadership reached for the biggest, most desperate lever in American marketing. January 1981. The NFL playoffs. Schlitz spends $1.7 million on something no beer company had ever done. Live, unscripted blind taste tests on national television. 5 broadcasts. 100 drinkers of a rival beer each time, sipping from unmarked cups, climaxing at halftime of the Super Bowl, in front of roughly 100 million people, refereed by an actual retired NFL official, Tommy Bell. The pitch: watch Budweiser and Michelob drinkers discover, live, that they prefer Schlitz. At the Super Bowl, against Michelob, the result came in 50% chose Schlitz. 50%. Schlitz's own 100 million viewer stunt announced mathematically that its beer was indistinguishable from the competition. A coin flip. The company spun it as a triumph. Half of their drinkers picked us. But you don't bet the brand on live television to prove you're a coin flip. The gamble was brilliant, brave, and beside the point. The beer was no longer special, and everyone, including the 50%, could taste it. 6 months later, the heart stopped. Milwaukee's workers, 700 of them, walked out in June 1981, and this time there was no empire to protect. Schlitz closed its Milwaukee brewery. The beer that made Milwaukee famous was no longer brewed in Milwaukee. The vultures circled fast. Heilemann bid. Pabst bid. The Justice Department blocked them both on antitrust grounds. A final indignity. Schlitz was now small enough to be bought, but its buyers were too big to be allowed. And in June 1982, the Stroh Brewery Company of Detroit took Schlitz for about $500 million. Sounds like a lot, until you learn that between 1974 and 1982, the value of Schlitz had fallen by roughly 90%. A century of brand, burned in 8 years. One detail from the fire sale deserves its own frame. Schlitz's newest, most modern brewery, Baldwinsville, New York, was sold off separately. The buyer, Anheuser-Busch. The company that had refused to speed up its fermentation now brews inside the walls Schlitz built with the money it saved by speeding up. History rarely writes its ironies that cleanly. The afterlife was long and strange. The debt from the Schlitz deal sat on Stroh's books like a stone, and in 1999, Stroh itself collapsed under it. The acquisition that was supposed to build an empire helped sink its second one. Schlitz passed to Pabst in the fire sale, a family heirloom nobody remembered the story of. Then, in 2008, something genuinely poignant. Pabst resurrected the real recipe. Brewers dug through documents and interviewed retired Schlitz brewmasters to reconstruct the classic 1960s formula, the pre-spreadsheet beer. And for a while, on a few shelves, you could taste exactly what a generation of executives had traded away. It wasn't enough. Nostalgia can revive a recipe. it can't revive a habit. In May of this year, 2026, Pabst announced it was halting Schlitz production, citing the rising cost of storing and shipping it. The last batch was brewed on May 23rd at Wisconsin Brewing Company and released on June 27th with a small farewell celebration in Verona, Wisconsin. Awake with taps. Officially, the brand is on hiatus, still, in Pabst's words, a cherished part of our history and, hopefully, our future. Maybe. But as of this summer, for the first time in 177 years, nobody anywhere is brewing Schlitz. Here's what makes Schlitz worth 20 minutes of your time in 2026. Nobody outside the company ever beat it. Not Budweiser, not Miller, not Prohibition itself. Every wound was self-inflicted, and every cut was rational. Ferment faster, the numbers work. Swap the barley, no one can tell. Hide the additive, it's legal. Deny the flakes, they're harmless. Shout louder. Buy the Super Bowl. Somewhere in that chain, a 100-year promise quietly became a lie, and the customers knew before the executives did. They always do. Business schools call it the Schlitz Mistake, and it has never stopped happening. To beers, to phones, to software, to whatever you, watching this, are building right now. Quality is the slowest thing a company builds and the fastest thing it spends. If this story was worth your time, the next one is Stranger. An American icon that died without anyone noticing it was gone. Subscribe, and you'll be there when it drops.